Societies are not static. They can grow stronger in might, in wealth, in virtue, or in a whole range of other areas. Artistic achievement, intellectual vigor, all sorts of things, right? But they can also decay. Corruption can take hold. And when it does, it not only harms the society as a whole, but it harms the individuals, families, and communities that make up that society. That's what we want to talk about this morning. And that's what Isaiah is really talking about. Remember, Isaiah as a prophet his ministry is more than 100 years, really more like 200 years, into this divided kingdom. This Judah in the south and Israel in the north. And Isaiah is, with the help of God, shining a light upon the corruption of his own society. But when you do social analysis, whether you're doing cultural anthropology or whether you're doing sociology or whether you're doing political science, where do you begin? That's always the question, right? Because any society is like an organism. It's almost infinitely complex, and its various elements are inextricably interrelated with one another. So again, where do you begin? Because it is like the Gordian knot. If you pull on one string, the whole knot tightens. And you're left kind of, well, how do I tease all of this out? Well, I think it's interesting to observe where God begins. Where the prophet Isaiah begins. There is this collective amnesia that afflicts the people. Notice there in verse 3. The NIV translates it as, "My people do not know. They do not understand." No object to those verbs, right? Well, that's because in the Hebrew there is no object. Now your translation may put an object there. It may say something like, "My people do not know me," right? Pulling from the analogy that God is using in the first half of that verse. And that's perfectly acceptable. It helps you be clear about the primary focus of what God is talking about here. But I think the lack of objects in these Hebrew sentences is instructive. Because in fact, there is a whole panoply of issues that the people do not understand, and it's all really one phenomenon. There is a historical amnesia. They don't remember who they were before God intervened. There is a theological amnesia. They don't remember who God is. There is a relational amnesia. They don't remember who God is to them. So moving this question of who God is from the abstract, from the theocentric, to the concrete, the anthropocentric, you might say. Okay? And because they don't remember this history, because they don't remember their theology, because they don't remember the relationship that they have with God, there is also a covenantal amnesia. They don't remember the obligations that they have to God. And this is where God begins. In His unpacking of what is going on in Israelite society. Now, our text, our series, I should say, that we've been on the last couple of weeks and that we're on this week and a couple of more weeks, is about how we do civic engagement. It's biblical perspectives on civic engagement, we're calling it. It's perfect for an election season. But I'm going to mention this again at the end, but I want to emphasize it here now as well. Remember that for us as Christians, this applies to us first, not as Americans, but as Christians. We need to start exploring these questions as the people of God, right? Because how will our neighbors know the answers to these questions if we ourselves do not? In fact, we shouldn't be surprised that they don't know the answers to these questions. But it should grieve us when we are afflicted by this kind of amnesia. Now, let's turn again back to our sort of analysis of Israelite society. We want to look at these faces of corruption. How did this amnesia manifest itself in the way that this society functioned? Now, you'll notice for this major section, I don't call it the faces of corruption. I just call it faces of corruption. Why? Because this is not an exhaustive list of all the ways that Israelite society had been corrupted, much less an exhaustive list of the ways that our own society might stumble into corruption, or we might say, our churches. But the list is illustrative. It helps us to open our eyes to some of the possibilities that we might encounter. And you might want to flip over for a moment to Isaiah chapter 5, because we're going to pull a lot of this information from Isaiah chapter 5. And the first face of corruption that we're going to talk about is economic corruption. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, especially verse 8. What's happening in Israelite society? You have this very limited commodity, land. Okay? Now, God had set up Israel's system to preserve inheritance, to give some pretty rigid structure to how land was distributed. Have you ever thought about why? I did some research this week and I found that if you combine the modern state of Israel with the West Bank, you have something on the order of about 11,000 square miles. In fact, it's a little bit short of 11,000 square miles. Or 1/5 the size of Arkansas. That's a pretty limited area in which you're trying to put a nation, right? So what was happening? Well, you have these wealthy landowners who are accumulating land. They're building house upon house until there is no room in the land for anyone else. And in this society, without land, you don't have access really to the economic system. You don't have access to the mechanisms that will allow you to improve your lot in life, that will allow you to assist your family. That's why the what we call the Jubilee system was so important in ancient Israel. Every 50 years, the land was supposed to go back to the original owners. As far as we know, that system was never practiced. It was instituted by God, never practiced. And so people continued to accumulate land until there was no space for anybody else. Let me tell you something. In the ancient world, if you are a worker for someone else, it was very difficult, especially if you're a farmhand, it was very difficult for you to feed your family, much less to make something good out of your life. Now, part of this economic disparity was created by corruption in the judicial system. So we have this judicial face of corruption. But I want you to notice chapter 5 of Isaiah, verses 21 through 23. Particularly verse 23. You know, when we think about, and by the way, there are references to corruption of the court system all over the prophets. It was a problem that was pervasive in Israel basically throughout the nation's history. This was a bribery culture. As one of my former professors put it, he said, you know, and he had been a missionary in a bribery culture. He said, look, the locals there just call it greasing the wheels of justice. The problem is that bribery cultures deprive the least advantaged people of access to justice. That's why chapter 1, verse 17 makes this reference to the widow, the orphan, the alien or stranger, however you want to translate that Hebrew word. That threefold reference that we find in the law, in the prophets, and in the writings. It's all over the Old Testament. But the thing is, that judicial corruption, as verse 523 points out to us, didn't just affect economic issues. People could commit far more heinous crimes and get away with it because they had money, because they could bribe the judges. So there is a judicial face. Now, remember, we're talking about faces of corruption. You're talking about an economic face so far. You're talking about a judicial face. These are some of the most important aspects of a society's public life, right? But then you have this conceptual face. That's what I've called it here. You've got this conceptual face. And I really want you to look there at Isaiah 5:20. What does that verse say? It says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put sweet for bitter and bitter for sweet." There is this pervasive category confusion throughout the society. It's sort of like I've put up here on the screen for you a picture of what's called a destroying angel mushroom. It's a whole group of mushrooms that look very much like edible mushrooms, but are actually highly toxic. And that's what happens to us when we substitute good for evil and evil for good. When we confuse, either on accident or intentionally, what is right and what is wrong, what is a blessing and what is a curse, what is a manifestation of God's presence and goodness with that which is evil. Now, it's bad enough when an individual does that, right? It creates this terrible confusion, this inability for the person to find their way out of destruction, to find their way out of harm, to find their way out of illness, mental or spiritual. Talk about that in a moment. But what happens when a whole group of people do this? A whole social unit. It can be as small as a family, or it can be as large as a nation. When an entire group of people engage in this kind of conceptual substitution, this kind of conceptual confusion, it becomes mutually reinforcing, right? People don't just learn how to be human by watching other humans. They also learn how to think by watching how other humans think. And pretty soon you have an entire society, sometimes within a society, where people literally cannot think their way out of the hardships that they experience. We have seen this in our own modern world. I watch way too much true crime stuff. I know that I do. And as one detective put it, he said, we really should not have murder as entertainment. But I can't help it. I keep doing it anyway. And it's so interesting to hear experienced homicide detectives talk about, quote unquote, the streets. And when they're talking about the streets, they're talking about an entire, well, to use the cultural anthropological term, culture, if you will, that has its own set of evaluative criteria about what's good and what's not. That has its own set of what we call social scripts. That's how you respond to certain social stimuli, certain social occurrences. So, if I bring Roy a rack of ribs, he's supposed to say, thank you, right? Okay? Mm-hmm. That's the social script, right? We consider that to be polite. That's what you do. If Roy doesn't follow that social script, he might be thought to be rude. Even if he's not being rude, he might just be thought to be being rude, right? So these streets create this whole set of social scripts. And if you don't know the script, you can end up in crosswise with somebody in this sort of subgroup, right? But here's the thing. What happens if your social scripts are corrupted? What happens if they're based on deformed and defective values? What happens if they are actually counterproductive? What happens if the entire structure of that social unit is bad for the people who participate in it? And what happens if those bad, evil ways of relating to your social environment are actually being promoted by people for their own interests? It was happening in ancient Israel, and it is happening in our own society. I love the phrase that one thinker used. He called it the outrage industrial complex. People who make money, make their money, whether it be on talk radio or on social media or on podcasts or on news channels, by getting you angry. That's how they make their money. And in the process, they promote all kinds of things. Sometimes they do, society a good service by shining a light on things that really shouldn't be. But most of the time, what they're doing is they're just ginning up conflict between you and somebody else. And they're profiting off of it. And that's just one way that we do this kind of thing as a people. There are so many ways that we can become those very people who confuse good for evil and evil for good. And it produces the most egregious corruption, the kind of corruption that can be almost impossible to get out of. But there's one other face of this societal corruption that Isaiah wants to highlight. And for this one, we go back to chapter 1. The text that Natalia read for us this morning. Look there at verses 10 through 15. There is this liturgical corruption, this corruption of worship. Now, in order to understand why God highlights this so early in Isaiah's prophecy, we need to kind of put ourselves in the position of Israel as they are hearing the prophet's message. You can almost imagine people saying, "Oh, no, wait a minute, Isaiah. You can't say that about us because we have offered our sacrifices. We're good. We're good with God. We not only have we offered the prescribed sacrifices, but we've given even more sacrifices." So God can't feel that way about us. You can almost hear the echoes of words that people in our own churches will never say out loud. "Oh, wait a minute, preacher. Don't bother me with this stuff from Isaiah or Hosea or Amos or Jeremiah or Ezekiel. I prayed the sinner's prayer. I put my faith in Jesus. I even got dunked in the baptistry. I'm good." And what God is saying is, well, let's summarize it using an old commercial. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Their worship is corrupt precisely because it is not a doorway for their sanctification. Rather, it is a mechanism for them to bribe God, just like they bribe their judges. Right? And God will not be bribed. God is not impressed with their many sacrifices. Just like God is not impressed if you can sing every song in the Baptist hymnal and you have the whole Anglican Book of Common Prayer memorized. And yet, you oppress the poor. You victimize people in your church. You harm children. You prey upon women. God is not impressed. Natalia watched a movie this weekend about it was one of those true story movies, based on a true story, about a lady out in California who, to make a long story short, a minister was on trial for molesting her son and a bunch of other kids. And this was in the early 90s. They weren't using forensic interviews. His attorney was making headway in some ways. And so basically in the middle of the trial, she walked into this side room where the man was waiting on certain things to happen, and she just shot him. And of course, some people are like, well, you can't be a vigilante. Other people are like, can we dig him up and shoot him again? And I told Natalia, to be honest, I lean more towards the second option, because in part because of the pure arrogance of this man who called himself a Christian minister. God will not tolerate that kind of corrupt worship, in no small measure because it deprives our worship of its power to do what it really needs to do in our lives. To draw us into the presence of God. To transform our hearts and our minds. Not just so our hands will be clean, although that too, but also so that we can receive the blessing and comfort of God. Can you see how these many faces of corruption feed upon one another, interact with one another, deepen one another? It's no wonder that in verse 5, God says, your whole head is wounded, your whole heart is, the NIV uses afflicted, but I like the word sick. And that really turns our attention to the consequences. What are the consequences of this societal corruption? Well, one of them obviously is divine punishment. That's what most of verses 5 through 9 are about. They're about this punishment that the people of Judah, and yes, the people of Israel as well, are experiencing right as the prophet is speaking. It's like he can look out his window and say, look around you, see what is happening to your very nation and how that's connected with your own behavior. And what's really interesting about the way that God's punishment so often works is that God doesn't actually come down from heaven with a baseball bat and beat you about the head and shoulders. Although that's the image that is used in these verses. That's not how it actually happened. How it actually happened is just the natural flow of history. The natural course of events. It's very interesting. You'll see over and over again these prophetic texts where it says God is going to do blah, 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 blah. And then what you find out is, well, no, actually it's not God who's doing it. He's just letting the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and whoever else do what they do, which is always going to be harmful to this society that will only stand if it stands together under the protection and leadership of God. But there is another aspect to the consequences of this corruption. And I want you to look there at the end of verse 5. And it is that phrase I just pointed out. Your whole heart is sick. You see, we cannot participate in the corruption of our society without ourselves becoming corrupted by it. We cannot participate in the corruption of our political systems, our economic systems, our whatever it happens to be. Everything from, from commercials on TV to social media, it's whatever it happens to be. We can't participate in that corruption without ourselves becoming corrupted by it. And once that corruption takes hold in our hearts, we do not have the power to liberate ourselves from it. That's the message of the New Testament. And one of the reasons is because what's the prescription that God gives? God's prescription is stop doing wrong. In a sense, it's sort of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's like, okay, so we're going to establish some new habits, okay? Instead of oppressing your neighbor, you're going to advocate for your neighbor. And God just gives this whole sort of list of things, but it's all basically the same thing. Stop doing evil stuff. But what the New Testament teaches us is that without God's help, we can't. The corruption just takes too deep of a hold on us. Just this morning, a pastor friend of mine who texts me every Sunday morning with a scripture and a brief reminder, he texted out of James, I think it's chapter 1, where you have this little progression, sin takes root, and then desire conceives sin, and then sin gives birth to death. That's how it works. Sin becomes not so much what we do, but it becomes a spiritual cancer, a sickness that eats away at the fabric of our soul and at the fabric of our society. Now, let's close by reminding ourselves of how we take this material and apply it to our situation. Okay? No, we don't live in a theocracy. Okay? That's not, and our responsibility as Christians, as I told you before, is to apply these texts to ourselves and our congregations first. Okay? It's also to recognize that there is always a connection between political dysfunction and societal corruption. Now, the nature of that relationship, that's another matter. Sometimes it feels like this is like a chicken or egg kind of thing, right? Which one came first? And they're both so interrelated that it can be hard to tease all of that out. But we know that there is a relationship between the two. And there is nothing wrong with us as Christians saying to our neighbors, hey, be warned. Be warned. all this political dysfunction that you don't like, and rightly so, it's related to the corruption of our society's values. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we need to do that even as we apply the messages of Isaiah to ourselves first. Another thing that we can do and should do is we ought to deconstruct the toxic rhetoric of political leaders. We need to be the first to recognize lies for what they are, right? It doesn't matter if it's, a Democrat saying, well, I believe that all children are God's children, when he actually advocates for abortion up to the 40th week. Or whether it be some kind of Republican saying, all the illegal immigrants that are coming here are rapists and murderers. We ought to be the first ones to see through destructive, toxic, evil uses of rhetoric. People who are calling evil good and good evil. We ought to be the first ones who see that. And we have every right, and I think every obligation, to call our politicians to lead in a way that is good for everybody. We have every right to demand that they institute policies, build institutions, and exercise power in a way that is good for everyone, especially for those who need the protection of the state and the assistance of society. And we need to emphasize this point, in fact, that this way of conceiving of the public task, the political task, is not, N-O-T, not an invention of modern Marxist theory. It is not communist to say, hey, our government needs to work for everybody. You know what? Our government needs to, it needs to be fair to everyone, regardless of their wealth or ethnicity or whatever. Everybody should be equal before the law, but our government should also have its eye on how are our policies and institutions and uses of power affecting the most vulnerable people. That is not a Marxist point of view. That is a biblical point of view, one that permeates all of Scripture. Government can be just and equitable and fair without being Marxist. And I will also add, by the way, that the desire to punish those who do wrong is also not an invention of, white Southern racists. It also permeates all of Israel's scriptures. We can do these things as a nation, and we can advocate for these things as Christians. We just need to remember that Isaiah speaks to us first, and that as we proclaim these messages to our neighbors about the connection between political corruption and social corruption, about the obligations of government to its people, all of these things, as we proclaim those things, we actually need to live them too. We actually need to live out our commitment in our daily lives to oppose the various kinds of corruption that infect us all. Let us pray.